Today we are going to finish up the handout for early humanity, and what I need you to do is follow the methods that we use in class. First, you're going to look at all the questions. Before you do the reading, highlight each question, and then as you do the reading, highlight any possible parts of the reading that could be used as an answer for that specific question in the appropriate color. If you see something that does not make sense or that you don't understand, a word, phrase, or an idea, bold it and then make sure that you ask me a question. Now, obviously, we are not in class, so you'll have to ask those questions via Google Classroom, but that's perfectly fine. You can still do that. Then you're going to listen to this video, and you're going to talk about the handout, where I talk about the handout, and use it to beef up your understanding, and then you need to answer the questions in as complete a manner as possible. The reading begins with 6 different definitions. You need to make sure that you know what they each mean. I'm not going to go over them in the video because it's pretty much self-explanatory, but you do need to be able to know the difference between fission and fusion. Those are also terms that you would see in science class, and you need to know the difference between the mother group and the daughter group so that you can see how each individual grouping of humans would have split off and formed as separate groups. The very first paragraph is going to be talking, it's basically my summary in written form of an article written by Robin Dunbar and Richard Sosik. And in that writing, it talks about how groupings of people come together and the ways in which they grow, and at which point they will grow to such a size that they have to split apart, right? So when they're going to actually hit the fission point, when they're split into two. And the stability of these groups is based on multiple different criteria, and the optimal size is going to be, the optimal size meaning the best size for that group, is going to be determined based on the local resources. And so if you had ample resources, a lot of clean water, a lot of food, a lot of places for people to have shelter, then you would have a larger size group before they would have to split. Now, if you were lacking any of those things, the optimal size of the group would be much smaller. And so you're going to look at the places in which these groups live to see the different sizes of these groups. In addition to that, if you look at the bottom of that very first paragraph, it seems that groups who had attained some sort of religious understanding had a deeper social cohesion, which meant that they had a better linking of social relationships within inside of those groups, and they don't really have any known explanation outside of religion being that social glue that held them together. And so if they did have a shared religion, and we're talking about in ancient humanity, for whatever reason, they could reach group sizes that were larger than the local ecology would suggest they would be able to. So they would have groups that could exist outside of how a different group might exist in terms of the available food, the available water, the available shelter. Also, it's important to know that human communities are not fixed in size based on the length of years in which we can attain. Any group is going to grow larger and larger over time as more humans are born than actually die off. And so these groups follow a particular pattern. You have the mother group that begins with several groupings of people that have different genetic backgrounds. We talked about that yesterday. The reason why you would have such different groupings, though, is because if you had too many people who were related, you would have a lot of DNA problems in terms of their children, and so you'd have to have a different genetic background in order to make sure that there was enough of a difference that you wouldn't run into those problems. Over time, those groups would begin to grow as more people have babies and less people die. And eventually, the amount of the people in that group is so large that they can no longer self-sustain based on the environment, and then fission occurs, and then you have two daughter groups that split off from the main group. So you have group A and group B, and then they would follow the exact same cycle. You'd have families with different genetic backgrounds. You'd have more people born than die. they would reach a certain level that the environment can't sustain, then they would break apart. Now the problem though is if you ever reach that fission point before you had an optimal size. If you broke into two before you were large enough to do so, you could run the risk of one or both of those groups reaching catastrophe, reaching doom, because they don't have the ability to survive based on just the number of people that are there. Also, you can look at the things that we talked about yesterday in class and see that that might also lead to a loss of knowledge if you have too few people in those groups. So it's important that you pay attention to that. So in terms of the questions, what impacts how a human grouping will be successful? And it is going to be multiple variables that will lead to the success or failure of the group. A group size is dependent upon the environment that it finds itself in. They cannot outgrow those resources available to them, nor can they have so few members that any particular calamity or problem could doom the group. It seems that communication is important to keep appropriate balance and allow everyone to do their part. The second question, and remember you're using these to look at your answer and make sure your answer is as full as possible and not to copy my answer. Why would communication allow groups to reach an optimal size before fusion occurs? And why might poor communication end up poorly for the group or for an individual? So looking towards primate behavior, it would seem that intergroup competition, so group competition between members in the group, is what leads to a split. And so good communication allows the group to take care of any competition, any back and forth before it reaches a tipping point where there has to be a split. The larger the group grows before you reach that point, the more likelihood that they are going to survive and that they are going to thrive. Poor communication might lead to group fission or group split before they've reached that size, which would spell doom for both groups or just one of them. And in terms of the individual, poor communication could lead that person to being ostracized. So they could be socially or physically shunned from that group. And if we're talking about ancient humanity, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of years ago, that could mean death in some cases if they couldn't find a different group to be a part of. And so it would be very, very important for communication to occur. And so the thing that we are going to be focused on next week is going to be nonverbal communication, how to use hand gestures, how to use facial expressions, how to use our posture, how to use tone of voice. Because as we've discussed over the past several days, the majority of the time humans have been on the planet, that's how we've communicated. And so it's important that we focus in on those traits and we fix any problems that might occur so that we can communicate to the best of our abilities. So what you're going to do is make sure that you upload your answers for these two questions to today's assignment. Make sure that if you have questions, you submit them on Google Classroom. And then remember, tomorrow you're going to upload your copy of the Campfire Talk. So we wrote that in class. It's a minimum of 1 minute. If it's not 1 minute, you need to choose something else. And I want a maximum of maybe 3 or 4 minutes. It doesn't need to be too long, but it's going to be a story that you tell us about yourself, and that's going to be your assignment for Friday. If you have any questions about today's assignment or tomorrow's assignment, make sure to let me know as soon as possible, and I will get back to you almost immediately. Have a great day.